if Germany's not partitioned, and for example, you don't get then East and West Berlin, you don't get the Berlin Wall, the Berlin Wall doesn't fall, and therefore you don't get that kind of momentous occasion which kind of triggered the collapse of the Soviet Union.
They would have wanted to hang on to most of the gains that Germany had made during and before the war. This would have been completely unacceptable to the Allies, so there would have been some tough negotiations. But the important thing would have been that millions of lives would have been saved if the regime had collapsed.
I mean, Goering is a clever operator. If you look at the psychological reports from Nuremberg, Goering is a smart cookie. Look at him when he was younger, much more dashing, fighter pilot. He's the poster boy of the Nazi regime.
Operation Valkyrie, one of World War II's boldest resistance efforts, unfolded on July 20th, 1944 in Nazi Germany. Led by German army officer Claus von Stauffenberg, the plot sought to assassinate Adolf Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. Stauffenberg smuggled a bomb into Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters, placing it near the dictator to trigger a coup and dismantle the Nazi government. The bomb detonated, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries, and the coup quickly collapsed. Stauffenberg and many of his co-conspirators were captured and executed. But despite its failure, Operation Valkyrie remains a symbol of defiance against tyranny, highlighting what's considered the bravery of Germany's internal resistance and the complexities of wartime opposition. I'm James Hanson, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus in a different key moments of history, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's Operation Valkyrie, the daring plot that aimed to overthrow Hitler and end the Nazi regime. But what if the plan had actually worked? What if Claus von Stauffenberg's bomb had killed Hitler? The coup succeeded and the resistance seized control of Germany. Well, that's a question for our experts, and joining me today, as ever, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Parry. And for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by the historian and journalist Nigel Jones. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into the specifics of Operation Valkyrie, Chris, I wonder if you can set the scene of what is happening in the war in the summer of 1944, and why there are some in the German regime who are increasingly dissatisfied with Hitler. Yeah,
well, in the east, of course, the Germans suffered a disaster at Kursk, this major sort of battle and reverse. The Russians are advancing on a broad front now. They're withdrawing from Leningrad, and the whole front is threatening to collapse. It's ahead of the collapse of our Army Group Centre. That hasn't happened yet. More importantly, though, a month before, we've had D-Day. And although the Allies have landed in northern France and places like that and are now bombing heavily Germany, they're still stuck in Normandy. But essentially, the second front has been opened. I think the key point is that this is a lot closer to Germany than the Eastern Front is. So you've got a bit of an issue there. Italy, for the Germans, is becoming very unstable. They're having to decide whether they want to defend Italy at this stage. They've had, obviously, the defeat of Rommel and the Afrika Korps in northern Africa here. And they basically are not sure about how long their Italian allies are going to stay in the fight. And so everybody's thinking it's going the wrong way now, and we could lose this war badly. The biggest worry for everybody in the army and amongst the population is the Russians coming in first, getting there ahead of the Allies from the West. You see a lot of documentation at the time, letters from the front, but also in diaries as well, that the Russian threat is the greater.
Nigel, welcome to History Undone, first of all. Great to have you on the channel. I suppose there are many, many military reasons why some within the German regime are dissatisfied with Hitler. Are there other reasons as well? Are there other motivations at play here for deposing him?
Very much so. The two main motivations, I would say, are the moral dimension of the military caste who are disgusted by what they've seen on the Eastern Front in terms of massacres of Jews and other war crimes, and the military discontent over the disastrous decisions that Hitler has been making on the the Eastern Front, mainly on the Eastern Front, his micromanagement, which has led to the disasters of Stalingrad and then Kursk. So they can see that Hitler and the regime are leading Germany literally into the abyss of defeat.
And I think it's important to stress as well that by the time you get to Operation Valkyrie, that is by no means the first assassination attempt against Hitler. He has survived several by this point.
Indeed, he has. The first or the earliest major one came in 1939, just after the outbreak of the war, a couple of months after the outbreak of the Second World War. A lone wolf called Georg Elser, a communist and a craftsman who his profession was watchmaking, constructed a bomb, a booby-trap bomb, which he then, over a period of weeks, hid in a pillar in the Burger Braukeller in Munich, the beer cellar where every year Hitler went to commemorate his famous beer hall putsch of 1923, his first bid for power. And Elsa knew that every year, come what may, this was the one date and the one place where Hitler definitely would be. So he constructed this bomb. He hid it in the pillar behind where Hitler was going to speak. And after the commemorations that year of the beer hall plot, the beer hall putsch, the bomb indeed went off, killed half a dozen people in the beer hall. And Hitler, who had been speaking literally minutes before, had, protected by providence or luck or whatever, had left the hall and boarded a train to go back to Berlin unexpectedly early. So he narrowly survived that, although, as I say, the bomb brought the beer hall down in ruins and killed half a dozen people.
So had he been there, this would not have been like Valkyrie. If he's in the room, he's dead.
He's definitely dead, yes, absolutely.
Chris, there was also one in 1943 involving a suicide bomber.
Well, I mean, there was a whole series of assassination plans for when he visited Army Group Center in Smolensk. In the first case, there was this opportunity to get him on the way from the train station. That was abandoned because the security was too tight. There was also a plan to shoot him at a dinner that he was going to attend. He didn't attend, so that didn't happen. And there was another officer who said, well, actually, I'll be the first suicide bomber. I'll go and actually, with an explosive, and kill myself and Hitler. And that never happened either. I mean, it is actually quite remarkable the extent to which he escaped. Now, when those have failed, they said, OK, what we're going to do is we're going to put a bottle of liquor in a plane that Hitler's going back with. That actually was put on the flight. Unfortunately, because of the weather conditions, the pilot decided to climb above the clouds to the freezing level, and the detonator froze, so it didn't actually go off. That bottle of liquor had to be retrieved very rapidly at the other end by people in the conspiracy to make sure that it wasn't rumbled at that stage. So he was leading an absolutely charmed life up to this point. There's no question about that.
Incredibly lucky. Nigel, did the Allies ever sort of plot an assassination attempt?
The Allies were very much put off from cooperating with the internal German resistance to Hitler because they'd had their fingers badly burned at the beginning of the war, at the exact moment when Georg Elser planted his bomb in Munich. Here, on the borders of Germany and Holland, the two heads of the British Secret Service in Holland had been tricked into a series of talks with SD, the internal intelligence agency of the SS, into believing that these people were plotting Hitler's downfall, but in fact they were agents of Heydrich and Himmler, the regime. And on the border, when they were having their meeting with these guys, they were kidnapped. The Germans just swept across the border, scooped them up and took them into a concentration camp. So the British decided then and there, especially after Churchill had become Prime Minister, that they would have no truck with dealing with people who purported to be the resistance to Hitler. They'd lost their two chief spy masters in Holland and they weren't going to risk any more embarrassing disasters.
However, if you go to the National Archive, you'll see Operation Foxley.
Yes.
Which is basically a British plan to say, look, we know that Hitler goes to the Berghof pretty often, and there's a whole series of plans. First of all, they think about poisoning the water supply and things like that. Then there's also a whole series of assassination attempts, one that looks very much like the assassination of Heydrich, another one where they want to ambush him on his afternoon walk. And so that was in play very much when Valkyrie is actually happening. And the British plan, I have to say, if you look at it, the way it's actually scoped, the way they've got alternative plans, actually it could have worked. If you'd have gone in and got close to Hitler on his way to his tea room when the security was actually at its lowest, then you might have actually achieved it. So if you're interested, Operation Foxley in the National Archives is a superb resource for how you might have actually got. It's actually almost rather like the eagle has landed in reverse.
Or Day of the Jackal, actually, the attempt to assassinate de Gaulle. But the important thing is that they would have no truck with the German resistance.
Correct, yeah.
Yes.
Foxley was a purely British SOE plan, and they were mistrustful of all Germans by that stage in the war, in fact.
And if you are Hitler at this point, how paranoid are you about assassination attempts?
Quite. I mean, he did take certain precautions. He's reported to have kept a parachute under the seat of his plane. He's reported to have his cap lined with metal. But he said himself, specifically, if an assassin is willing to sacrifice his own life, there is very little that the potential victim can do to stop him. If the assassin is determined enough and luck is on his side, the assassin can get through.
OK, well, that's some of the context of what is happening in the war in the summer of 1944. Before we get on to the events of Operation Valkyrie itself, let's just get into some of the key statistics. The plan involved key military units and conspirators spread right across Germany and the occupied territories. Around 200 individuals were directly involved in the plot, with 7,000 arrests made in the aftermath as the Gestapo sought to uncover the extent of the resistance. Of those arrested, just under 5,000 people were executed or died in custody, highlighting the severe crackdown that followed. The explosion at the Wolf's Lair killed 4 people and injured 20 others. Hitler himself survived with minor injuries. The coup's massive failure led to purges within the Wehrmacht, with over 1,000 officers dismissed or executed. And while the conspirators sought to mobilise elements of the German Reserve Army, only a fraction of its 2.5 million troops were even aware of the plot, limiting its chances of success. The plotters underestimated the speed of Hitler's loyalists in regaining control, with communications restored and counter orders issued within 12 hours, quashing the coup entirely. OK, Nigel and Chris, let's discuss some of the key moments. I suppose the first thing we should say, Nigel, is, what is Operation Valkyrie? Because it's become associated with the July the 20th plot, but actually it's got a far broader meaning.
The original Valkyrie was a legitimate military operation involving the Reserve Army, which is rather like the German version of Dad's Army, the Home Guard, reserve troops who were in Germany at the time. And it was originally designed to put down a possible rebellion by the million or so slave workers, forced labourers, foreigners who were working in Germany at that time to replace the troops who'd obviously gone off to fight on the various fronts. So the conspirators in the Reserve Army, in the higher ranks of it, devised a second Operation Valkyrie, which they called Valkyrie II, to convert the original plan to put down this rebellion by slave workers into a full-blown coup against the Nazi regime. And this was going to take place not only in Germany itself, but in other centres of Europe that had been occupied by the Germans, like Paris, in France, in what was then Czechoslovakia, in Prague there, and in Norway, countries that had all been occupied by the Wehrmacht earlier in the war. So it was going to be virtually a Europe-wide coup against the Nazi regime, a very wide-ranging plan. Trouble is, it had to be hidden from the Nazis, and not all the officers in the army were obviously in touch with the conspiracy and plotting. There was a whole hardcore of Nazi loyalists who had to be placated, or the true aims of the conspiracy had to be kept hidden from their eyes, kept secret from them. And the key centre of Valkyrie was a building in Berlin, the headquarters of the Reserve Army, called the Bendler Block, in a street that's now called Stauffenbergstrasse. And that is where the plot was hatched. But in order for it to take place, Hitler had to be killed. And the key figure in the Bendler Block, the key figure in the conspiracy, was this aristocratic, handsome young officer called Count Claus von Stauffenberg, who'd been grievously wounded in Tunisia in the last campaign of the African War. He had lost one eye, one hand, and all but 3 fingers on his remaining hand. So he wasn't exactly ideal material for an assassin. But he did have one disadvantage over all other assassins in that he had regular access to Hitler. As Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army, he was often invited to join Hitler at military conferences at his home in the Berghof, and then after Hitler left the Berghof, in the Wolf's Lair headquarters on the Eastern Front, or near the Eastern Front, here in East Prussia. So that was why Stauffenberg, as well as being incredibly dynamic and energetic, was chosen, or rather volunteered himself, as the assassin.
Yeah, Stauffenberg, a key figure. Anyone who's seen Valkyrie, that film, will know that it's Tom Cruise who plays him. Who are some of the other key co-conspirators, Chris?
Well, you've got a number of people who've been associated with the German army before the war. You've got General Beck, you've got several politicians, you've got a lot of Catholic conservative types. And we shouldn't really confuse these people with being anti-German. They are absolutely hardcore German nationalists in many ways. They support an authoritarian sort of government. And in many ways, they reflect what I would call the regime under the Kaiser. That sort of regime. These are not Democrats by any means. The military guys, in many cases, have actually supported what the regime have done up until now in France and in Russia. And as Nigel says, it's only the atrocities really that have appalled people. There are several politicians. Godelier, who is going to be the Chancellor, he is brought in. And there are several other people. Amazingly, the police chief of Berlin is part of the conspiracy, and he has been a heavily repressive figure, but he's part of it as well. So it's a whole load of people who actually have something to lose. That's the key point. If the regime allows the Russians or the Allies to invade and Germany collapses. So you've got a motley collection, basically, of ex-military. You've got an ex-field marshal and all these people who say, look, we've got too much invested personally and nationally in the way Germany exists. We can't afford to let the country go down under the Nazis.
And Nigel, when we talk about the plotters, was Rommel involved?
Peripherally, he was. He was quite prepared to confront Hitler and say, listen, Führer, my Führer. Rommel, of course, was on the Western Front fighting in Normandy at that time until he was severely injured and had to go home on leave. But he was not prepared in any way to countenance assassination, killing Hitler. And this was always a point of disagreement among the top plotters. Some of them were only prepared to arrest Hitler, put him on trial, whereas the hardliners were quite prepared to go through and assassinate him. And the longer the war went on, the more the hardliners got through, achieved the upper hand in their argument, and they were, in fact, determined to assassinate Hitler. But Rommel was such a popular figure that he couldn't be tried after Stauffenberg's plot had misfired. He couldn't be put on trial because that would just show the German population as a whole that the top generals, the most popular generals, the most ardent and successful generals, had also become disillusioned with the regime. So that was why Rommel was persuaded, pressurised into committing suicide by the Nazis rather than put on trial with the other conspirators.
So, Chris, talk us through how the plot was meant to play out.
Yeah. As Nigel's mentioned, you've got the Wolf's Lair, the Wolfschanze, which is Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters in East Prussia. And the key point there is it's basically a fortified area. It's got lots of guards, it's got lots of fences, it's got deep underground bunkers, obviously, to protect people. And most of the conferences take place in underground conference rooms, which give you a high level of compression for explosions. Now, again, as Nigel mentioned, Stauffenberg is the Chief of Staff of the Reserve Army. It gives him access to Hitler roughly every 2 weeks to actually brief on behalf of his general, a chap called Friedrich Fromm. And on that basis, Stauffenberg is seen regularly at Rastenburg, and he flies up there with his aide. Now, what they're planning to do is kill Hitler on the day when Goering, his Vice-Führer, and also Himmler, the head of the SS, are there on the same day. And that's absolutely critical. They think it's not enough to get Hitler, we need to get the other two as well. And it's set up for the 15th of July. And there's a famous picture of Stauffenberg actually standing in line meeting Hitler on that day. And it's all set up for the 15th of July. And Hitler doesn't go to the meeting. There's also maintenance undertaken on the underground bunker. At that point, when he goes back to Berlin, Stauffenberg hears that actually the Gestapo may be onto them. And so his sponsors, General Albrecht is one of them, and the other people involved say, look, it doesn't matter, we'll get Hitler if we can. And it looks like the 20th of July there's going to be a meeting. They're not sure whether Himmler or Goering are going to be there, but Hitler is going to be there on the 20th of July. Stauffenberg flies up with his aide to the Volkshansa and essentially tries to prepare 2 bombs with British detonators that were provided by Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, the head of German intelligence and counterintelligence, who is working half and half for the Allies in that sense. Not for the Allies, but on behalf of Germany against the Nazis, let's put it that way. Because of his physical disability, he can't actually put the detonators in both bombs. And he's being hassled as well because Hitler's coming, we've got to get the conference underway. What he's done is arranged, though, to be able to sit himself next to Hitler. And he can place his briefcase as he goes into the meeting right next to Hitler under the table. And he's arranged also that there's going to be a telephone call that takes him away before the bomb detonates. And so what he does is, that's what happens. The bomb is placed very close to Hitler because Stauffenberg is sitting next to him. The phone call happens, he's called away, and another officer, an aide, actually slips in and just says, oh, I can actually take this place here, sees the briefcase is sticking out and tripping him. He pushes it behind the oak leg of the table. And about 8 minutes later, the bomb goes off, and Stauffenberg assumes that actually it's happened. Now, the real problem is that the site of the meeting had been altered. As I said, there was maintenance on the underground meeting room, and it's been basically put in a wooden structure with windows that are open because it's July, so it's pretty hot. And so the compression of the blast actually is dissipated. And because it's displaced away and that chair leg shields Hitler, his trousers are blown off, his right side is fairly perforated, and he loses the hearing in one of his ears because his eardrum is shattered. 4 people are immediately killed, 20 others are injured. And if you look at the blast damage that occurs, had that blast occurred where it should have done, there is no question that Hitler would have been killed. And Stauffenberg assumes that is the case.
Yes.
And flies back to Berlin with the news that actually he's dead.
Well, Nigel, do you want to pick up the story? What happens when Stauffenberg gets back to Berlin?
Confusion reigns because the head of communications at the Wolf's Lair, the general in charge, was aware that there'd been an explosion, but he then saw Hitler staggering out of the building and realised that Hitler was alive. And the conspirators have made no provision for this eventuality that the bomb would go off but that it would survive. They always assumed that once the bomb had gone off, it would kill Hitler, but that hadn't happened. But then Stauffenberg arrives belatedly on the scene, and the signal for Valkyrie, for the coup to be triggered, had not gone out, had not been issued from the Benderstrasse in Berlin to the rest of the conspirators in Paris and Prague and elsewhere, because no one at the Bendler block was sure whether Hitler was alive or dead. Communications from Rastenburg, from the Wolf's Lair, had been cut off in the immediate aftermath of the explosion. So beyond knowing that there'd been a blast, they didn't know what was going on.
Had it been the original location of the bunker, would the communication still been intact? And could they have got the message back?
No, I think the communications were cut off as a security measure. They didn't know who had planted the bomb immediately, though it became swiftly apparent to the Nazis that it was Stauffenberg was the man, because he'd bluffed his way, in the immediate aftermath of the explosion, he bluffed his way out of the enclosure, out of Rastenburg, and had taken an airplane back to Berlin. The problem was the uncertainty about whether Hitler was alive or dead, because officers, including loyal Nazi officers all over Europe, would have, in my opinion, immediately sided with what appeared to be the winning side. If Hitler, the fount of all their hopes and all their wisdom, had disappeared, I think that would have been a mortal blow at the regime itself. But once they knew that Hitler was alive, then the coup very swiftly collapsed.
And Chris, do you want to explain how they found out that Hitler was alive?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting that you have a situation where there was a telephone call made to Goebbels, basically, and Goebbels recognises Hitler's voice. And he calls in the person leading the major element of the reserve army in Berlin itself. He's a major, and he says, "I'm putting you on the phone. Do you recognise this voice?" says Hitler. And the major says, "Yep," clipping his heels very closely together, I think. He said, "Look, I'm still alive. Do what you have to do." And from that point onwards, I mean, I think there's another issue as well. You're getting all sorts of conflicting signals going back and forth. You've got the conspirators in the Benderstrasse are trying to send out orders to everybody through the telecommunications system. You've got other stuff coming in from Rastenberg saying, look, ignore everything. And it completely jams up the ability of the conspirators to coordinate any sort of action across Europe in that respect. But as soon as Hitler is able to say, I'm alive, Goebbels is able to say, right, get back in. Let's get the reserve army now working for us as it is supposed to, and let's release the SS that have been arrested by everybody. Let's get the word out to Paris, Prague, and all these other places. Then it's all over. And there is a broadcast that night by Hitler to the German people saying, "You may have heard there's been an incident, but here I am. I'm still leading you to victory and everything else, and carry on as before." Meanwhile, there's a massive clear-up of the conspiracy.
Well, yes, Nigel, talk us through what happens with the co-conspirators.
Yes, well, there's actually a gun battle in the corridors of the offices of the Bendler block because the head of the reserve army, a general called Friedrich Fromm, had played a very, very ambiguous game. He knew that there was something going on under his nose, but he'd been very careful not to side with the conspirators. But because he knew what was going on, his immediate impulse was to shut down the conspiracy and to eliminate the leading conspirators who might be able to point the finger at him. So he, in his own office, having been arrested by the conspirators because he refused to join them once he knew that Hitler was alive, he had a drumhead court-martial, gave Stauffenberg and the others 5 minutes to write their last letters to their loved ones, and then had them hassled down the staircase of the Bendler block into the courtyard and shot by a firing squad that had been drawn up there. So when Goebbels arrives at the Bendler block, he says to Fromm, "You were very quick to get these conspirators underground, weren't you?" Goebbels smells a rat. Goebbels realises that Fromm really knew what was going on. And indeed, Fromm is later himself arrested and shot by the Nazis when they realised that he did have some awareness that the conspiracy was carrying on under his nose. The rest of the conspirators, first of all, they scatter as best they can from the Bendler block. But in the days and weeks that follow, they are then rounded up and they are put before a brutal Nazi court called the Volksgericht, the People's Court, presided over by Hitler's hanging judge, a really nasty guy called Freisler. Without any pretense of legal formalities, he screams abuse, he insults the poor conspirators who have already been tortured by the Gestapo in captivity, and then without any further ado, he sentences them to death. And Hitler had already said, "I want them hung up like sheep, like cattle." And that's exactly what happened to them. They were hassled away the day that they were sentenced to a prison in North Berlin called Plötzensee, and there they were hanged. It's said by piano wire. That isn't quite true. They were hanged by very thin cords, but it was a humiliating and horrible procedure. And the investigations continued practically till the end of the war, and hundreds of not only officers but civilians as well who have been implicated or even had just discussed the progress of the war with the conspirators, they were arrested and in most cases went to their deaths in the last months of the war.
And Chris, we mentioned earlier Rommel's sort of peripheral role in the plot. He does end up getting the blame for his involvement, and he is, well, he's offered a way out, I suppose, with an element of dignity.
Yeah, he's offered basically the opportunity to commit suicide rather than, and of course the pressure is on your family. That's the point. You know, if you commit suicide, then we won't bear on your family. You see, with Stauffenberg's family, you know, his wife is put in the concentration camp, and his children are sent to orphanages. And they're lucky to survive, you know, that, and their names are changed and everything. So the implicit thing with Rommel is we'll look after your family if you behave. And as Nigel hinted earlier on, you don't want a public show trial of Rommel, the Desert Fox, this famous general, who, by the way, is defending us from the Allies in the West at the moment. So much better that he just disappears quietly, and he's given that option, he takes it.
Well, there we go. That is the real history of what happened during Operation Valkyrie. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, let's ask ourselves now, could Operation Valkyrie have succeeded? Nigel, to start with you, I suppose the crucial thing is, what if the bomb does kill Hitler?
I think the Nazi regime was so focused, so personified in Hitler's demonic personality. My personal opinion is if it had killed him, the regime would have been in high danger of collapsing everywhere. We haven't really mentioned much of what went on in Paris, but in Paris the coup had completely succeeded. All the SS and SD men had been arrested by the army officers there. The Normandy front would have collapsed. That would have been the end of the Wehrmacht's resistance in France. And I think there's every chance that the regime would have collapsed. What would have been the difficulty then is that the Allies, including the Soviet Union, had already made clear that they would only accept unconditional surrender. Whereas I think the conspirators hoped, because they were, as Chris said earlier, they were right-wing nationalists, they would have wanted to hang on to most of the gains that Germany had made during and before the war, including the Sudetenland, if not Czechoslovakia as a whole, probably parts of the border with France and so on. And this would have been complete, and the Anschluss with Austria. This would have been completely unacceptable to the Allies, so there would have been some tough negotiations. But the important thing would have been that millions of lives would have been saved if the regime had collapsed. The fighting fronts would have stopped, and the conspirators obviously hoped to carry on fighting the Eastern Front, fighting against the Bolshevik hordes that they saw coming in from the east. But the millions who died as part of the Holocaust, the millions of soldiers who died on the fighting fronts, the civilians in their thousands in the cities that were being bombed to rubble by the Allies, those lives would all have been saved if Hitler had died on July the 20th, 1944.
Well, that is a key point, and we will return to that. Chris, do you agree with Nigel that if the bomb does kill Hitler, is that the fall of the Nazi regime?
I don't know. There's an alternative view, I suspect. I mean, I take exactly the points that Nigel makes. We've got to remember, the conspirators said, we've got to kill not just Hitler, we've got to kill Goering and Himmler as well. And I think there's a little truth in there. Remember that Goering was actually the deputy Führer. Now, the key issue associated with Hitler is an oath that was made by the armed forces before the start of the war. The reason the army initiated this was to try and draw Hitler away from the party and make him more integrated with the armed forces. They recognised it actually backfired, and actually the oath became very sacred and really tied people in. And many of the excuses that people make for not getting involved in this conspiracy are about the oath to Hitler. Now, interestingly, in 1945, when Hitler does in fact die, Dönitz becomes his successor, and the first thing he issues is the oath that you made to Hitler remains in place even though he's not here. So a counterfactual that I would like to put on the table is actually the regime doesn't collapse because the transfer of power to Goering and Himmler remains in place. And we've got to remember that Goering and Himmler, between them, are controlling quite a lot of resources of the Nazi regime. So as long as they're able to assert control over particularly the army in the east, and I take the point about the west, Nigel, then the regime may just hang on. And you've got a slightly different Nazi regime than you would have had under Hitler. It'll take a time to re-establish itself, but just seeing how Dönitz tried to take control of the regime in the face of huge collapse. Let's not forget, in April, May 1945, the regime was collapsing completely all over the place. You can see the seeds of how maybe there had been a transition of the party regime into that new arrangement. There may even have been infighting amongst the top echelons at the end of the day.
And do you think it would be Goering who would succeed Hitler because he was Vice-Führer, essentially? Or do you think there's a chance that you get this power struggle and Himmler emerges?
Maybe so. I mean, interestingly, Himmler is put in charge of the reserve army afterwards, as part of his, and he fails spectacularly to actually to deal with that. He's not a great military leader. I suspect, I mean, the other thing one has to consider here is that the reaction to this is one of betrayal by most Germans. At the time, they're thinking, and the discussion amongst the Nazi leaders that you see from the records at the time is, you know, I'm sure the German people will be outraged by this. And in fact, they are outraged. At a time when the war is really going badly for us, somebody has tried to decapitate the regime. So I suspect there might have actually been an initial, oh yeah, there's trouble, but I think a real emotional and political reaction to say, we've got to hold together here. And all it would take is for Goering to say, I'm in charge now. You know I was the successor, designated by the Führer. His work continues.
Yeah.
So I'm sceptical, I have to say. I mean, Nigel's points are entirely valid, but I'm sceptical that there would have been a collapse of the regime in total. I think the West is certainly an issue at this point, particularly given the sympathies of quite a lot of the military leadership there. But in the East, they want to hold firm against the Russians. That's the point.
I do want to come back to what a Nazi regime without Hitler might have looked like and what that would have meant in a moment. Just on the events of the plot and how they could have played out differently, Nigel, once Hitler hasn't been killed, is there anything the plotters can do to try and make Operation Valkyrie work? I mean, if Goebbels isn't able to get Hitler on the phone, for instance, does that change things?
I think it would have done. Well, it all hangs on Hitler's life. Once word had got out that Hitler was alive, and indeed his voice was heard for the first time for many months, that night, broadcasting in radio and saying he's going to take revenge against what he called a small clique, although it was in fact quite a large clique of plotters who had conspired against him. Once that word goes out, then all bets are off, all loyalties to Hitler are reinforced, and people are looking to save their own skins, quite frankly. Even the top military leaders who are not lacking in courage on the battlefield, but when it comes to moral choices, they remember their oath to the Führer and they all fall over themselves, including Dönitz, one of the first to broadcast the Navy's loyalty to Hitler. They fall over themselves to reaffirm their loyalty until the end, until victory, until the Sieg. We will stay loyal to Hitler.
It's very interesting. The previous Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Dönitz's predecessor, Admiral Raeder, is very quick in his retirement to go and see Hitler 2 days afterwards and say, look, you know, the Navy is on side, and so am I, by the way. Okay, he takes a pistol with him and then berates the SS guards for not searching him before he goes in to demonstrate his loyalty. Say, look, I brought a pistol along and you still haven't got your security in place here. And it makes a tremendous effect on Hitler. And Hitler says, you know, I'm glad I can count on the Navy. We haven't had anything from 1918 involved in this plot. You know, not quite true, of course, because Admiral Canaris is involved in this plot, but he doesn't know that at that point. And he says, you know, I'm really grateful that the Navy has stood aside here and not taken part at all in this plot.
So had the plot succeeded, had Hitler been assassinated, had the Nazi regime been overthrown, as you think would have actually happened, Nigel, what does the leadership of Germany then look like? Because they actually did devise a plan as to who would get what job.
They did. They portioned out the jobs, and poor old Stauffenberg, as a reward for his self-sacrifice in virtually condemning himself to death for carrying out the assassination, he was going to have the great office of Under-Secretary for War. He wasn't even a proper minister. He was a pen pusher, which I think was a great injustice.
Not great when you've lost a hand and most of your fingers.
Absolutely.
If you're a pen pusher, is it?
Absolutely. But the Chancellor, as I think we said earlier, was a politician, quite a minor politician called Goerdeler, who had been a mayor before the war and the commissioner for prices early in the days of the Third Reich. Other the other generals were given top jobs, and the regime, in its political complexion, there was a bit of a split between some, like Stauffenberg, the younger ones, who were prepared to cooperate with people like the socialists, even the communists possibly, in a broad-based government, and the core of the conspirators, who were the old-style Prussian nationalist conservatives, who wanted a firmly right-wing nationalist government. So there was a bit of a split in them, but they had assigned these jobs. And I think they would have come up, and I think Goering, had he succeeded, would have also come up against the unpleasant reality that the Allies would have stayed united. Stalin would have been suspicious about what was going on anyway. But I think the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies would have held, and they would have insisted on unconditional surrender. They would have had no truck with a long series of negotiations with the new regime in Germany, or indeed with the old regime if Goering had taken over.
So therefore, do they surrender earlier?
Yes.
And when do you think that might have been?
I think that would have been after a couple of months when they realised that the Allies were not interested in negotiations and that war was going on rather than jaw, so that the war would go on, the bombing of German cities would continue until they surrendered. And I think military reality would have kicked in, and political reality, and they would have seen that if we want to stop the war, if we want to stop our cities being bombed, our boys dying at the front, we've got to talk, we've got to basically capitulate to whatever the Allies want. And the only way of preserving Germany and keeping Stalin's armies at bay is to agree to what the Allies want.
So potentially World War II in Europe ends in September, maybe 1944?
Yeah, ends probably about 9 months before it would otherwise have done, which may sound like a short time, but it would have saved literally millions of lives.
I think there's another issue here. I wonder if the problem in the East is that the Russians want to come on anyway. And if you look at the Germans, they might say, look, we're going to oppose you softly. We're not really going to oppose you. Come and occupy us before the Russians do. If we're going to go for unconditional surrender, we want to surrender to you, not the Russians. So I see a situation where you see the Allies taking over. And you're saying to Stalin, basically, you're really going to take on your allies in Germany. Because I think the best option for a regime after the Nazis was to say, come on in. Come and occupy us now, come and help us build it, keep the Russians out.
And that would have fundamentally changed the latter half of the 20th century.
Well, it depends what Stalin's aims would have been at this point. Now, Stalin at this point is known since 1941, the Manhattan Project is underway. So he's thinking, how close are they to getting a nuclear bomb? So am I really prepared to take them on? What are my aims here in Eastern Europe? Maybe Poland, certainly the Baltics, Hungary, Romania. I might satisfy myself with this, all the way down to Greece, maybe, okay? But I can see a scenario where the Germans say, we'd much rather have you guys in here from the West, the Americans, the Brits, even the French, actually, and do this. And if you're confronted here with that, what do the Russians do? The answer is, I don't think you take on the Allies.
I agree with that. I think that is the correct scenario, and that's what would have happened.
Let's go with the scenario you posited, Chris, about the Nazi regime doesn't collapse. Even if Hitler is assassinated, you end up with Goering or maybe Himmler leading a Nazi regime. What does that regime look like, and how does it then prosecute the war from that point on?
I think it does the same as the Stauffenberg conspirators would have done. Himmler was pushing for negotiated settlement quite early on, actually, and right towards the end, of course, he betrays Hitler by actually getting involved with negotiations to surrender. I mean, Goering is a clever operator. If you look at the psychological reports from Nuremberg, Goering is a smart cookie. You know, he's got this image of being this rather overweight operator. Look at him when he was younger, much more dashing, fighter pilot. He's the poster boy of the Nazi regime, and he is intelligent. And I have a suspicion that actually they've gone, you know what, we are losing this. So how can we actually bring Germany to the negotiating table? And again, you may have seen the situation whereby the Western allies are encouraged to actually get involved. And of course, the whole drumbeat of the Nazi regime is, how can we turn the Western allies against Russia so that they don't invade the whole of Western Europe. So I suspect that Goering, being a smart guy, seeing the writing on the wall, and Himmler saying, you know, we can't hold on to this for much longer, may well have actually said, we need to do a deal now, actually. Hitler's gone, you know, we don't have any loyalty to him, we don't have his strategy in place. We've got to, I think the overwhelming thing here is keep the Russians out. So they're going to do anything to keep the Russians out.
So they still surrender to the Allies, but again, probably in the same way that if the co-conspirators take charge, it happens maybe towards the end of 1944.
Yeah, but the key thing is the agreement between the Allies that they will have no partial peace. So you've got to have peace on both fronts. But it's the point. The key issue is what Stalin does. So if you call a ceasefire or an armistice, does he really want to go back into Germany to finish off the problem? That's the key point. And at what point do the Allies say, hang on, just a minute, we can't completely allow Germany to be overrun by the Russians here. So, lot to play for. But I suspect, just looking around the edges of what Goering and Himmler are up to at this time, that they actually would have said, you know what, time to call it a halt here.
In either scenario, Nigel, if you end up with the resistance in charge, if you end up with someone like Goering in charge, what happens with the concentration camps? Do they become more like work labour camps as opposed to death camps for a few months?
No, I think Himmler, of course, was in charge of the concentration camps. And I think, as Chris said earlier, he was already doing deals. He did a deal with Swedish representatives to actually rescue Jews from the jaws of death and ship them out of the concentration camps. So I do think the final solution programme, the actual industrial extermination of the Jews, which went on right until the last weeks of the war. Jews were still being deported from Berlin, for example, as late as February and March 1945. I think that would not have happened. That would have stopped. So I think thousands, if not millions, would have been saved from the Holocaust, of Jews and other victims, but I think a lot of Germans would have been saved as well. I think the fighting would have, first of all, ground down and then eventually ground to a halt in the latter months of 1944.
I think that one of the things that could have happened very easily is that Goering could have said, OK, how do I consolidate my power here? I'm going to turn on the SS. That is a personal service that supported Hitler. And he could have taken Himmler out as well as a potential rival. I mean, the other one...
Himmler was not at all a popular figure.
Exactly that.
The SS were hated, and by the SS I mean the Gestapo as well. They were hated by broad sections of the population. And Himmler wasn't a particularly prominent figure. He did make speeches to his own SS recruits, but he was not a platform orator like Goebbels or Hitler was. And I think in any power struggle with Goering would have probably won.
And I think if you take the SS out of the scene, then you're taking all the apparatus of the extermination and things like that out. And Goering is demonstrating almost respectability, if you like, by doing so.
He's a pragmatist, a realist.
Yeah. I mean, Goering is probably one of the most underestimated leaders in the Nazi regime, to tell you the truth.
So if, therefore, war in Europe ends autumn 1944 sometime, what does post-war Germany look like? Presumably it is not partitioned.
Well, I think Germany would have been saved. Indeed, there would have been no communist-ruled East Germany. I think, as we were saying earlier, as Chris was saying, that Stalin would have probably, the Red Army would have occupied the countries of Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland as well, the country, of course, which Britain had gone to war to defend, I'm afraid would have, as it did, have fallen under communist rule, as would Slovakia, Hungary, remain the countries of Eastern Europe too. But I think, as Chris also said, that the Russians would have been kept out of Germany. So Germany would have been a united country again.
I mean, what is interesting is Yalta, which is where the Allies say, look, we're going to have spheres of influence. And this is yours, Russia, this is ours in the West, takes place after the 20th of July.
Yes.
So it would be interesting to see what a Yalta conference would have looked like in the circumstances that we're talking about. So you've got a situation where we're saying, well, actually, these spheres of influence now include Germany as part of the Western sphere of action. And Stalin's then horse trading to say whether Czechoslovakia, Austria, and these others remain within his sphere or not.
Do you think it would have affected in any way, shape or form the war in the Pacific? If, for example, the Americans are not having to worry about Europe that much earlier, does it change any of their operations in the Pacific theatre?
By this stage, of course, the Americans are really wound up. They're about to take the Philippines. You know, they've got their way across. You're adding an awful lot of manpower and resources, also naval power as well, to be able to go and reinforce that. The question is, then, is the conventional military power enough to actually take on Japan without using the atomic bombs? I suspect they're going to be used anyway. We've discussed before on this programme the fact that if you take huge numbers of casualties in defeating Japan, subsequent election, people are going to say, well, why didn't you use the atomic bomb and save all those boys' lives? So you're going to reinforce and you're going to allow the Americans to take much more giant steps towards defeating Japan. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the key question I would ask is, does Japan then say, we've lost our two allies, Italy and Germany, we need to make a peace ourselves here based on what we've got? The key problem, nagging sore there, of course, is China. You know, unless you can get Japan out of Manchuria, then the Russians aren't going to be happy and so forth. But you know, I think the Pacific campaign rolls on and
probably ends in a similar way, yeah.
And I think steamrollers Japan, to tell you the truth. I don't think the Americans had enough resources to complete the job. There's no question about that. It just makes the job easier, I would suggest.
Nigel, do you agree?
I do agree with that. I think the effects of the failure of the July plot and the assassination of Hitler would have been felt in Europe and specifically in Germany itself.
There's a lot of military reputations don't get made, of course, if this happens. I mean, Montgomery doesn't
yes, it's very true.
Get much of a reputation in Europe. Bradley, Eisenhower, they're all very frustrated because they're...
Well, therefore, does Eisenhower become US president?
Well, yeah, absolutely, down the line.
10 years' time or so, yeah, absolutely. I also wonder as well, if Germany's not partitioned and, for example, you don't get then East and West Berlin, you don't get the Berlin Wall, the Berlin Wall doesn't fall, and therefore you don't get that kind of momentous occasion which kind of triggered the collapse of the Soviet Union. So potentially in the long term, it would have been better for the USSR, or is that too speculative? No,
I think communist rule was so disastrous in Eastern Europe that it would have come to an end sooner or later. I mean, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a largely symbolic event. Communist regimes were collapsing all over Eastern Europe at roughly the same time, and I don't think that would have changed. I think German recovery would have been much swifter after the war, and Germany would have become the powerhouse of Europe, the economic powerhouse of Europe, as indeed it did become eventually much earlier on because it was united.
But the key question is, one we've asked before in relation to if the First World War had ended earlier, how do you solve a problem like Germany? Because you leave it intact, powerful, industrially sort of very advanced and wealthy. How do you make sure that it doesn't become a problem again? So that would have been the question, is how do... And I think, essentially, it would have been some sort of concert of nations, either a European Union type structure or indeed NATO type structure, to actually bring Germany into the society of Western and democratic nations.
Do you think some of those post-war institutions, I mean, we had the European Coal and Steel Community, obviously, first of all, but also the UN, do you think those kind of institutions still come about if the war in Europe ends in...
I do. I still think there would have been a great deal of disgust for what the Nazi regime had done when the concentration camps were revealed, for example, and the truth of the Holocaust came out, and also the fact that they'd occupied most of Europe with horrendous consequences for the populations. So there would have been a lot of resentment of Germany and a determination by post-war politicians to make sure that Germany was not in a position to threaten the peace of Europe again.
And reparations probably as well. You know, not on the scale of the Versailles, but some way of doing that. One thing I think is worth emphasising here is that you don't really hear about Stauffenberg being a hero or any of these people being heroes in Germany. It's about 1990. None of these
after
streets,
unification,
none of these streets or anything else. And remember, we said at the time in the war, the Germans felt betrayed by this, the fact that they were doing that. And there's this very odd psychosis. it goes right through to when Germany is unified, 89, 90, where you don't see any Stauffenberg Strasses, you don't see any memorials.
Stauffenberg's eldest son, ironically, became a general in the post-war and never heard a shot fired in anger, of course, unlike his father, who had only been a colonel in the Nazi Wehrmacht. And he had a rather embarrassing career in the army. There were quite a few people who would, when he introduced himself, yes, I'm General von Stauffenberg, who would sort of...
Shun him.
Not exactly shun him, but say, you know, was what your father did right? Was he not a traitor?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very ambivalent attitude after the war. Quite extraordinary, really. And as I said, it's not until after unification you start to see, you know, the proliferation of all these sort of commemorations.
Yeah, memorials. Yeah, exactly.
And actually, a key point you made earlier, Nigel, is of course, you know, millions of lives would have been saved, not only on the battlefield, but also in terms of, you know, what happened in the concentration camps and with the bombing of German cities. And therefore, do you have the same need for the Marshall Plan?
I think you do, because Europe is pretty devastated, not only Germany, just about every country in Europe, East and West, had suffered, and of course Eastern Europe would not have taken the Marshall Plan, it would have only been Western Europe, had suffered grievously, Britain not excluded. You know, there were a lot of cities lying in wasteland rubble, and I think, yes, America would have been generous, and I think American money would have been used to put Europe back on its feet. There would have still been the fear of communism and Soviet expansionism.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Cold War would still have happened, I think.
I mean, that's a key point. The Marshall Plan is not just there to restore devastated Europe. It is actually to forestall
communism.
But also communism within these countries, not just the external threat from communism.
Especially Italy and France.
Italy and France, you've got to keep them on the right side, literally. And I think that's a major part of it. And we've got to think that, if the Russians are dominant here, the influence of communism is going to be huge in Western Europe. I mean, they're already talking in the Soviet Union of the tiny collection of states on the end of their continent.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, so you can see where it's going. So the Americans have got to be committed in that sense.
And the communists were heroes of the resistance in countries like France. The communists had taken the leading role in this. De Gaulle established himself at the end of the war, but the communists, gave him a good run for his money, and the communist parties in Italy and France remained strong right up until the 1980s. Very strong.
I think what is interesting is how do you deal with the war criminals here? So I think, my own view is that we'd have left it to the Germans to do it.
So there wouldn't be the Nuremberg trials that we knew?
We'd have had the Nuremberg trials, but probably run by the Germans to say, look, we're going to denazify ourselves. And indeed, the denazification process that took place up to 1948 was actually conducted by Germans. We wanted them to do that. And so I think you'd have seen a much more legalistic process rather than a retrospective sort of process that we saw at Nuremberg. And of course, Victor's justice. I was about to say, absolutely, this cry of Victor's justice. Also, you wouldn't have had the accusation, well, you think we're bad, look at this lot, why aren't they on trial for what they've done?
Chris, Nigel, this has been absolutely fascinating. We have studied many a battle on History Undone. This is the first time we've looked at an assassination plot, but I think we can say this is just as pivotal as many of those battles we've covered. I think, first of all, we can say that, yes, absolutely, Operation Valkyrie could have succeeded, certainly in terms of the assassination of Hitler. Had key things gone differently, had the suitcase with the bomb in not been moved, had the meeting taken place in the bunker where it was originally intended, certainly Hitler could have died as part of the July 20th plot. Had that happened, what is really interesting is what happens to the rest of the coup. Do you get the resistance taking charge? If that happens, they may have hoped for some kind of negotiated settlement with the Allies. Realistically, the Allies are clear. Total surrender. And so as a result, what probably happens is the war ends in the autumn of 1944. Let's say September 1944. The significance of that is millions of lives are saved in Europe. You don't have so many losses on the battlefield. You don't get the devastation of so many German cities. You don't get the brutality that we saw between 1944 and 1945 in the concentration camps. Millions of Jewish lives would have been saved. There's also a scenario, though, in which the regime does stagger on, even if Hitler is assassinated, that the full extent of the plot does not succeed, that the conspirators don't actually take charge. So who then does? Do you get Goering in charge of a Nazi regime? And is it a different Nazi regime? Could Himmler even have emerged as Führer after a power struggle. Either way, you probably get a similar outcome. They realise that the Allies are serious. They want total surrender. And so as a result, you end up with the war ending in Europe in the autumn of 1944. The key question there is, what does post-war Germany look like, and how does it relate to what the Russians are doing? What does the Soviet Union look like post-war? They probably don't, therefore, have any control over part of Germany. You don't get the partition of Germany that you do get post-war. And that would have meant the future of Europe in the second half of the 20th century could have looked very, very different. Some fascinating consequences, all stemming from one plot in the summer of 1944. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Nigel and Chris for joining me, and we'll be back undoing more historic moments very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone, on YouTube. And don't forget, you can also listen to History Undone in podcast form wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.